Good evening, church. A very warm welcome to every one of you here to join us for this very special seminar, Finding Peace in Pandemic Uncertainty. And we're so glad to have you here. I hope you had a dinner, and I hope that we are all good. Thank God it's Friday. So glad to have you join us here with us. Today we have a special guest with us, Dr. Max Jagannathan. Hi, Max. How are you doing?
Hi, Dennis. Thanks so much for having me. It's hope you can hear me okay there. I'm
Yeah, perfect.
coming to you from a balcony in Tangland. My kids have just gone to sleep, and so I hope they will stay asleep for the duration of the night. But it's a real blessing to be with you.
Yeah, so good to have you here. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you.
And Max Jagannathan is from RZIM Ministries, and he's here to share with us his thoughts about this topic. And before he go on in his sharing, I want to invite all of us in this session that you can ask your questions as well. Those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, on YouTube Live, we're so glad to have you here with us. And we want to just get you to ask questions about anything, about faith, about this crisis right now. If you have questions about your faith, anything that we can help you in, you can post questions down there and we can answer you. Those of you who are on Instagram Live, you will not be able to ask questions, but you can just tune in there as well. So, Max, I'll hand the time over to you. And over to you, Max.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dennis. I should also just make a quick confession. I'm not Dr. Max just yet. I'm doing my PhD at the moment, but I'm almost Dr. Max. But thank you for the kind introduction, nonetheless. Look, this is obviously a blessed time that we're able to kind of come together. So I'm really excited that you're able to join us here tonight. I'm so sorry that we can't be together physically, and we hope towards the day where that will happen again, and I'm sure it will. But in the meantime, we're not pretending like this is ideal, but it really is incredible that we're able to come together through the benefits of technology like this. So thank you for tuning in. I just wanted to start by saying that it doesn't really matter where you are with God tonight. If you are a follower of Jesus and you call yourself a Christian, if you might call yourself a Christian, but you've been struggling with your faith, you've got questions, particularly in the light of this pandemic and the lockdown and the difficulties that has brought you, or you might just be in outright rejection of God. You've never been a Christian, you don't know who He is. You might have been dragged along to join in tonight by a friend of yours from Hope Church. Wherever you are, I hope that this is useful for you and helpful for you. And I'm confident that if your heart and your mind is open, that God will speak to each of us tonight. So I just want to start by saying that. But it has been a difficult time over the last 3 months, especially, obviously with this pandemic, with the onset of this pandemic, and it seems like it might have to get a little bit worse before it gets better. So it's not an easy time. It's a time where we are looking for peace. We're looking for peace outside of ourselves, and we're also looking for peace inside of ourselves too. And it got me thinking about this little moment in history where humankind first landed on the moon. And the first words that were ever uttered on the moon, of course, were those of Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. And he said, as most of us know, obviously, that he said, "One small step for man, but a giant leap for mankind." These famous words that kind of rung around the world. What's interesting are the words that came after that, which most of us don't know. And they were spoken by Neil Armstrong's friend and colleague, Buzz Aldrin. He was the second man on the moon. And when he was asked to describe what he was looking at after he walked on the moon, he said very famously, but not quite as famously as Armstrong, he said, "Desolation, magnificent desolation." And I think those two lines summarize quite powerfully what a lot of us are going through in many ways. Even though we don't think about it in this context, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, that's where we have really come from as a society in the modern age, with 4 waves of industrial revolution, now moving past the first 2 waves of the communications and computing revolution into the first of probably 3 or 4 waves of the artificial intelligence revolution. We've achieved so much. The track record of humankind has been incredible. And I don't know where you're joining us from, but I know the majority of people watching this are sitting somewhere in Singapore. And Singapore is one of perhaps the exemplar societies that's applied itself, that's used innovation and intelligence and engineering and built strong institutions, built sovereign wealth funds. It's been well governed on any measure, and so it's been taking giant leaps, as this great civilization of humankind for many years now. And there are many societies globally that are in that place, which have, great infrastructure, great healthcare, sound economies, strong systems of supply and provision for their populations, and all of these sorts of things. And yet in the last 3 months, on some level or another, all of these things have just come completely crashing down around us. Now, maybe they haven't come crashing down to their entirety, but what we've been shown in the last few months is that any attempt that we have made to put our security or our identity or our sense of peace, either inner or outer, in any of these things has all been shown to be a waste of time. All of the systems that we've trusted in for so long have been shown to be vulnerable, fallible, volatile, and subject to the instability that's intrinsic to the world around us. Inside our world shown itself in the last few months to be unstable. Even our capacity to just go out and meet up with three or four friends for an iced coffee or an ice cream or to see a movie has been completely thrown out. We thought that we were the most advanced society, technologically, philosophically, academically, and intellectually. In human history, on any measure, we still are that. And yet, the benefits that we thought that all of those advantages could bring us have been proven to be completely illusory and completely deceptive. And so, I think it's more Buzz Aldrin than Neil Armstrong that speaks to us today. What we see now are not so much the enormous leaps of humankind. What we see, if we are honest with ourselves and we look at our society on the outside and we look at our hearts on the inside, is we see desolation. We see a need for peace. We don't see that comfortable first world kind of platform of pleasure that we've been telling ourselves for so long that we've had. And economically, politically, socially, financially, emotionally, and medically, it doesn't look like it's getting any better anytime soon. And we know that there's going to be no new normal. We know that even when it does get back to some semblance of normality, it's still going to be a very, very different world that we live in. So with all of that in mind, without wanting to paint too gloomy a picture, what does that mean for us, people who are trying to find peace? And the yearning for peace, inner peace, outer peace, comfort, stability, it is not a Christian yearning. It is very much a human yearning. It pours out of every human heart. And there are 3 things that I'd like to share with you today, 3 things that we need in order to be able to find peace in a pandemic world, amidst pandemic uncertainty. The first is to accept instability. The second is to deal with suffering. And the third is to find hope. We need to, if we are going to find peace in any way through this, we need to accept instability, deal with suffering, and find hope. And I just want to break those 3 things down for you briefly, share a few thoughts on those 3 things, and then look forward to taking your questions after that for a little while. So what's the first thing? Accepting instability. And this is really difficult, particularly for us as Singaporeans, as Asians. I was born in Sri Lanka. Even though I grew up in Australia, I very much grew up in an Eastern culture. My family, the diaspora in which I moved with in my younger years, was in large part subcontinental. And so I understand the Eastern mind, and the Eastern mind doesn't like the idea of instability. We're always trying to build stability into everything that we're doing. We like to know that our kids are going to the right schools, that we're academically streamed in the right ways, that we go to the right kind of university, that we get the right kind of degree so we can get the right kind of job, so we can meet the right kind of people, so we can have the right kinds of kids, move to the right kinds of HDBs and condos, and so our kids can go to the right kinds of schools, and the whole cycle of stability just goes again and again and again. That's just us. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just Asian. That's what I tell people when I'm speaking in Western countries like the United States and the United Kingdom and Australia. The Asian yearning for stability is probably greater than any other continent or cultural mindset that I've come across, certainly in speaking in Africa, speaking in the United States and the North Atlantic, and speaking across Asia too. So this yearning for stability has been met with its match here, with the pandemic uncertainty that we're currently finding. What does that mean for us? There was a guy called George Ritzer. He's a sociologist from the United States, I think. He talked about this phenomenon called McDonaldization. And McDonaldization, he was obviously referring to the fast food chain McDonald's in the 1950s and 60s when it was really taking off. But what he was really talking about was how McDonald's, the restaurant, was a symbol of something going on psychologically and culturally amongst people across the world. And it was typified and signified by McDonald's, but it really went far beyond McDonald's. It was this idea that we could kind of get what we want when we wanted it and have the kind of certainty and stability in our systems that we've always wanted. And for a long time, McDonaldization worked. We built systems, communication systems, digital systems, economic and financial systems, political systems, even psychological systems of pleasure and feedback loops of satisfaction that gave us what we want when we wanted it. And George Ritzer identified 4 things that were key pillars of McDonaldization, if we like. And when I look at the world around us today, particularly in South Asia, but globally as well, but particularly this generation, I see these 4 things that Ritzer was talking about. We are all hungrier for it today than we've ever been before. And here are the 4 things. He talked about effectiveness, efficiency, predictability, and control. Effectiveness, efficiency, predictability, and control. And what all of those things really are about are building systems that are calculable, that are replicable, and that are not volatile. Systems and models that we can kind of understand and keep doing things the same way. And what this virus has done is it's shown us that those systems only work well unless this sort of black swan comes and interrupts it. And as soon as you have a black swan event, and those of you who are in economics or finance or political science, and many others of you will know too, that a black swan event is an event that's just unexpected. It comes out of nowhere. And it's this idea, of course, that for a long time, people in Western civilization thought that all swans were in fact white, until they started getting to other parts of the world, namely the Southern Hemisphere, and started seeing black swans. Now, I've always found the black swan thing interesting because I grew up in a city in Australia called Perth. And in Perth, all of the swans are black. And so growing up, for me, every swan was black. In fact, I didn't see a white swan until we went for a holiday to London, the United Kingdom, and through Europe. And I started seeing all these white swans. It was all very confusing for me. And then I read Nicholas Nassim Taleb's book, and I studied the economic theories and so forth of black swans, and understood that when people say black swan in the context of politics or current affairs or economics or viruses or pandemics, they're talking about unusual events. But I think that increasingly the people of Perth have a much clearer read on predictability, because nowadays there are just black swans everywhere. And when we look through human history, we see that whether it was the Great Depression of 1929 and the 1930s, whether it was the World Wars, whether it was 9/11, whether it was SARS, whether it was the bird flu, whether it was the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the dot-com crash, whether it was the 2007-8 global financial crisis, all these things were referred to hilariously as black swans. And now people are referring to COVID-19 as a black swan. But I think if we're honest with ourselves and we look through history, all the swans are black. Every year, there's always something. There are always unexpected events and unexpected things that happen to us. And so we need to get used to the fact that instability is the new normal. Instability is quite simply the new normal. What we are living in now, and obviously and hopefully, lockdown is not the new normal, but there is no new normal. Instability is just the way it is. I think we have to get used to, and even the health minister was upfront about this the other day. He said, we're going to have to get used to potentially going in and out of lockdowns for a month or so now and then for the next 2 to 3 years. I don't think that's a ridiculous statement when you read what the experts are saying. And so in the midst of this pandemic, one thing that we can be certain of is the continuation of instability. And so we need to find a way to accept that. And that is a difficult thing for all of humankind to do. Particularly us Asians who love our stability, we love our predictability, we love our calculability and our control. We need to find a way to accept the reality of instability. Now, instability becomes much easier to accept if we have some kind of anchor point or stabilizer amidst the instability. The problem is, of course, that all of the stabilizers that human beings usually use have been proven not to be that stable, whether it's financial security or investment security or educational security or technological security. All of these things have been shown to be fallible at the very best and completely volatile at worst. So the instability that we have to come to terms with requires, I think, of the human heart some kind of anchor point, some kind of stabilizer that we can grab onto that is outside of the closed system, that is outside of the stormy sea, if you like. And when you think about anchor points, that's exactly how anchors work. They don't work unless they are attached to something outside of the storm. So it's no good having an anchor if it's inside the boat with you. You need to attach your anchor to the seabed or to the land. Otherwise, anything that is subject to the storm, the anchor will be subject to as well. So it doesn't really matter how strong our ships are or our boats are or how strong our anchors are, unless our anchor is transcendentally attached, it's useless to us. And what the Christian message offers us is a transcendental anchor, is an anchor that transcends the storm, an anchor that transcends COVID-19, it transcends lockdown, it even transcends life itself. So what you see when you begin to look at the person of Jesus and begin to examine the Christian message closely is you see a pathway slowly emerging amidst uncertainty, amidst pandemic uncertainty, through which we can find a stabilizer in our identity, in which we can build our stability, in which we can build our security, regardless of what is happening in the world around us. And that stabilizer is the person of Jesus Christ himself. So accepting stability suddenly becomes a lot, not necessarily easier, but a lot more possible and a lot more viable in both an intellectual and an existential and spiritual sense if we know that there is a person who knows us, who loves us, and who transcends the storm in which we find ourselves. So accepting stability, the first thing we need to be able to do. And the person of Jesus makes that all the more possible and viable. Secondly, we need to deal with suffering. That's just a reality. And I suspect we're going to talk a bit more about suffering during Q&A time. But dealing with suffering is just a reality of today. And dealing with suffering is not necessarily even linked to COVID-19. This is a reality of finding peace in pre-pandemic times, in post-pandemic times, and in pandemic times. Human suffering is ubiquitous, and you don't find anyone anyone that you speak to that will deny the reality of suffering, particularly at a time like this. So the question then becomes, when you look at the different worldviews out there, what are the different responses to suffering? No one's denying that suffering is happening. The question is, how can we make sense of it, and how can we deal with it and respond to it? And without having to go into everything specifically, we can look at the broad categories of worldviews that are out there, the broad categories of responses to suffering that we find out there. There's one category of worldview that doesn't deny God's existence. It will acknowledge that, yes, God does exist, but this category of worldviews will tell you that God doesn't owe you anything morally. There's no personal connection between you and God. And so your suffering is just your own problem. You don't really have any pathway or moral right even to complain about your suffering or to bring your suffering to God. He owes you nothing. And quite simply, you just have to shut up and take it. There is a category of worldview that says that. There's another category of worldviews that will tell you that any suffering that you're experiencing is your own fault. Something that you did, either in this life or perhaps another life, you've brought this suffering on yourself. All suffering is caused in some way, directly or indirectly, by the sufferer. That's another category of worldviews. There's a third category of worldviews that will tell you that suffering is not even actually real, it's just an illusion. And the reason that you're suffering, the problem that is leading to your suffering, is desire. The reason you're suffering is because you desire too many things. And desire is actually the cause of your suffering. So, what you need to do, what we all need to do, is to meditate ourselves out of desire. We need to get ourselves to a place of consciousness-lessness, if you like, where we don't desire anything. And when you don't desire anything, then you won't suffer anymore. And I can actually see the logic in that. If you desire your job or you desire your loved ones, your family members, and you lose one of them or something happens to one of them, then of course you're going to suffer. But if you don't desire anything, then there's nothing really that you can lose to fail suffering. So that's another category of worldview, that you just have to, meditate yourself to a place where you're not desiring anything, and therefore you won't suffer at all. The fourth and final category of worldviews, and there are plenty of worldviews within each of these categories, which is why I haven't gone into them specifically. But the fourth and final one are the atheistic worldviews. And the atheistic worldviews will tell you, if they're being honest with you, that your suffering is meaningless. That's how they process and deal with suffering. Because everything is meaningless to the honest atheist, because we are nothing but time plus matter plus chance. There is no claim to intrinsic meaning or intrinsic worth. Now, some atheists will dispute this or deny this, but philosophically, the only coherent atheist position is that all suffering is meaningless, because the atheist claim rest on a philosophical foundation that all things are meaningless. And the honest atheists, the smart ones and the honest ones, are upfront about this. Richard Dawkins, Bertrand Russell, these guys are very, very clear. Friedrich Nietzsche, they say that everything is meaningless because ultimately there is no God, so there is no meaning. And because of that, all suffering is meaningless as well. And Richard Dawkins has quite a chilling description of suffering where he says, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he says in The God Delusion, in a world of nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, where there is no meaning, what you would expect is that some people would get lucky, some people would get rich, some people would suffer. And you can add to that, some people would get raped, some people would get killed, some people would die of COVID-19, some people would live through COVID-19, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to any of it. We are just time plus matter plus chance. And our molecules and the meaninglessness of the universe neither knows nor cares. It just is. That is atheism wrapped up for you in the context of suffering. So those are four pretty bleak views of suffering in my view. One that says that, sure, you might be suffering, but God doesn't care and he doesn't owe you anything. Just shut up and take it. Another set of views that will tell you that suffering is your fault. Another set of views that will tell you that suffering is just an illusion. You need to meditate yourself out of it. And then the atheists that come along and tell you that suffering is meaningless, completely meaningless. For me, that's not compelling. It's not compelling intellectually. It's not compelling existentially. And it's not compelling emotionally. Alongside all of that, we then look at the person of Jesus Christ once again, and we examine what the Christian message has to say. Because if the Christian message deserves to be taken seriously, it, like any worldview, should have its response to suffering scrutinized and questioned. And so I think we should do that. And when we look at the Christian message, we see, once again, the person of Jesus. And we see in him and through him a God who doesn't tell us that our suffering doesn't matter. He doesn't tell us that it doesn't matter to him. He doesn't tell us that each and every sliver of suffering has been caused by the person who's experiencing it. Doesn't tell us that it's an illusion or that it's pretend. He tells us, no, suffering is real. Suffering is terrible. Suffering is a reflection of the brokenness of the world and the brokenness of us as people. But he doesn't leave it at that. He steps down into our suffering. He literally steps into our suffering as a person, takes it all onto himself, dies on a cross, and in doing so offers us two incredible things. The first is to promise to comfort and strengthen us through the suffering that we're going through, of which we're going through plenty at the moment. And secondly, he offers us an eternal future where there's no more suffering at all. Those are two incredible things: a God who suffered for us and a God who now is willing to suffer with us. So when we look at the need to accept instability, when we look at the person of Jesus Christ as a stabilizer that makes that possible, then we look at the need to deal with suffering, and we look at the cross of Jesus Christ as the means through which that becomes possible. Thirdly and finally, then, how can we find hope? How can we find hope in the midst of this pandemic uncertainty? And we look once again to the person of Jesus Christ. Because when we think about hope and talk about hope, and everyone talks about hope, hope is like love. It's one of those things that pops up in kind of every song, anything that's been written by Shakespeare, every movie that you've watched, anything by Taylor Swift or Justin Timberlake, or anything on Spotify. It always talks about hope and love, hope and love. And so hope is something that quite simply is about yearning for something more and yearning for something better. That's what hope really is. It's about yearning for something better, that desire in the human heart for something better than where we are now. And at the moment, in the midst of this pandemic, we can understand why there is a need for something to hope in like there has never been before. But the funny thing about hope is most people, most of the time, can have a tendency to just hope in the abstract, just to hope for things to get better. Now, that's abstract hope. That's actually pretty useless and uncompelling hope. It's useless intellectually, it's useless emotionally, and it's useless experientially. If someone's just hoping for something better, what good is that? Unless there is an object and subject for that hope that can bring about that better state of affairs, both in here and out there. That peace that we are looking for will never be found, either the internal peace or the external peace. It will never be found just hoping for peace. Just like the world that we want will never be found just hoping for a better world. The marriages that we want will never be found just hoping for better marriages. The kids that we want to raise will never be found just hoping for better kids. We need some kind of a catalyzer and an active presence and some kind of an enabler, some kind of a pathway that will enable the things that we hope for to be actualized. And that's where hope needs to have two criteria. If we think about what I've just said, there needs to be two aspects of hope if it's going to be effective hope and meaningful hope and hope that's actually worth engaging in. The first is that hope has to be reasonable. Hope has to be evidence-based. The object of our hope has to be grounded in evidence. Otherwise, we're just hoping in the sky. We're hoping in the clouds. We're hoping like, I used to hope as a 5'5", 17-year-old to play in the NBA. It's useless hope. It's just abstract hope with no reality of actualization. So hope has to be reasonable. The second thing is that hope has to be experiential. It can't just be intellectual or philosophical. I've spoken a little bit philosophically in this talk so far, but hope, if it's going to be grounded, it's got to be grounded in our hearts and in our lives. So what does this person of Jesus Christ have to say for himself in the context of these two questions? The need for reasonability and evidence, and the need for experiential power and experiential relevance. Well, in the context of whether this hope in Jesus is reasonable, whether the Christian message is reasonable, I'm really excited to be able to share with you that there is evidence that points directly to the person of Jesus. Inside the Bible, outside the Bible, philosophical evidence, anthropological evidence, archaeological evidence, textual evidence, non-textual evidence, cosmological evidence, anecdotal evidence, psychological evidence, and the list goes on and on and on. I don't have time, unless we want to be here till 3 a.m., to go through all of the different categories. Hopefully we can touch on some of them during Q&A. But if you follow the evidence to where it leads, as Plato said you needed to do in order to find truth, it will lead you to the person of Jesus Christ. The claims of the Christian message are grounded and anchored in evidence. The step into Christian faith, into relationship with God through the person of Jesus, is not a leap of faith. It's a very reasonable step of faith that's grounded in evidence. This hope that we Christians speak of is not abstract hope. It's not pie in the sky hope. It's very real, grounded hope. Hope in the person of Jesus, a very real person that lived and died and rose again in human history. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it, it's got to be experiential. We're still in the propositional and intellectual space. So this hope has got to manifest somehow in human experience. And with the person of Jesus, once again, it does exactly that. Because unlike any other worldview out there, life as a Christian, the Christian message manifests relationally. It manifests through an up-close and personal relationship. That's how Christianity works. And so, interestingly, I'm a lawyer by training. When I look at the history of words, which we do a lot in the law to understand the meaning of words, because they're so important in finding truth, when you look at the history of and the meaning of the word religion, Christianity is not a religion. Not on any sensible level is it a religion. Religions are about exclusively belief systems, rules, ethical precepts, rituals, traditions, all of those sorts of things. Now, I'm not saying Christianity doesn't have those sorts of things attached to it, but exclusively and primarily in its first instance, Christianity hinges on the foundation not of rules, not of ethics, not of laws, not of things to believe in, not of places to go or books to read, not of things you've got to say and do and feel. Christianity is anchored in relationship, a relationship with God, an up close and personal relationship with God through the person of Jesus Christ. We need to accept instability, we need to deal with suffering, and we need to find hope. And in my experience, and given what I've just spoken of, I see that there's no other way of doing that except through the person of Jesus Christ. He is the answer on all three fronts. He provides us with an anchor for our identity and our stability in the midst of the instability. He provides us with a pathway through and a hope beyond suffering. And he provides us with a transcendent hope to get through the suffering that we're struggling with now and for an eternal future where there's no more suffering at all. And that hope that is on offer for every single one of us today is anchored and grounded in evidence, and it proves itself not just through that propositional evidence, but also through the manifestation of a relationship that you and I can enjoy with God if we are willing to step into that relationship with him. And so I encourage you today, and I'm going to do it again during the Q&A as well, that if you haven't taken that step yet, to do that, to take that step into a relationship. If you've already done that, but you've struggled with it and you need to reaffirm that, there's no better time like now. We are in the midst of pandemic uncertainty. And at times like this, the fractures and the fault lines in the human heart come to the surface. These fault lines, the yearning for stability, the struggle with suffering, the need for hope, these are not caused by the pandemic. They've always been there. They've simply been brought to the surface by the pandemic. The pandemic has just been a magnifier, if you like, or a catalyzer of these things. These are age-old things that have been on human hearts since the beginning of humankind. They're just much more obvious now. And the answer to all of them is the person of Jesus Christ. And he is offering us a free gift of relationship and redemption and stability and endurance and redemption through suffering and evidentially based and relationally grounded hope through him and with him. That magnificent desolation that we're all feeling right now on some level, the magnificent desolation that Buzz Aldrin talked about when he looked at the moon. Our world looks a bit like that at the moment. It looks like it economically, looks like it financially, looks like it socially and emotionally. But Jesus Christ can deal with that magnificent desolation. All he needs is our willingness to step into a relationship with him. Thanks so much for giving me a hearing. Thanks for your time. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Max. Thanks so much for showing us that every one of us, we can find hope in this midst of uncertainty in the person, relationship of Jesus Christ. And those of you who just joined us as well on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, you have questions, you can type it in and ask those questions in the comments, and we hope to answer as many questions as we can this evening. So let me go with the first one that many of you are asking, is that why did God allow COVID-19, such a terrible thing that affects millions of people all over the world? Why did God allow COVID-19 to happen?
It's one of the most important questions going around. Thank you for sharing it, Dennis, and thank you to everyone whoever wrote in with that specific question, to everyone else who is feeling this. It's a really important question, I think, for the Christian to answer, and I think for the church to respond to. I need to start off with a very important disclaimer that I'm not God. And so usually when you ask someone a question about why they did something, it's best to ask the person that actually is the particular subject of the question. But I'm happy to give it my best shot because I think we can make sense of this question. Why did God allow this to happen? I think the first point is that we need to be very careful in getting two things down very clearly: the majesty of God and the smallness of humankind. John Stott, the great theologian, he wrote very powerfully and correctly, I think. He said, all human error begins with at least one of two mistakes. We either underestimate God or we overestimate ourselves. And a question like that doesn't necessarily explicitly make that error, but implicitly it definitely does. Because what it assumes is, it assumes that everything that God does and everything that God allows, that we would understand. And we have no rational basis for that assumption, sorry. We have no rational basis for that assumption. In fact, if God is who he says he is, and we look inside the Bible and we get a fair idea of who he is in the Bible, then we would necessarily expect there to be things that we cannot understand, that we are either incapable of understanding because of the smallness of our cognition in our minds. And we see evidence for that in the Bible, where it says things like God's ways are just higher than our ways. Or we simply don't have what the philosophers call epistemic access. We just don't have access to all of the information, to all of the reality that would count as truth, including perhaps the answer to that question. So it's important for us to take a bit of epistemological humility, if you like. And epistemology is just what you can know and how you can know it. So first of all, let's be clear on that there are just some things that we can't know. Either because of our incapacity and our cognition to know them, and partially because we just don't have the epistemic access to know them. And it's just similar to my son, Zachary. He's 2 years old, and he just is not capable of understanding multivariate calculus right now. If I try to explain the quadratic formula to him, he just wouldn't understand it. It's not because he's stupid. He's not stupid at all. He's actually really intelligent for his age, but his cognition is just not there. His brain development is just not there yet. He just doesn't have the epistemic access either. He's not sitting in a classroom. So in the same way, there are things about the world that I think we have to be okay with not knowing. And I think COVID-19 and something like this, to be honest with you, it falls into that category. The second point I would make is that we have to be really careful in ascribing causative factors to God. There are things that happen that are not caused by God. And I think COVID-19 actually arguably could fall into that. The best evidence that we have of how this came about is that this is a completely man-made virus. This occurred because of something that humankind did in our dealings with wild animals and in our dealings with how we were dealing with them, that then came to us, and then we have spread it. And the only reason it's spread is because of the geographic systems that we've built. If COVID-19 happened 500 years ago, it wouldn't have been a big deal at all. It would have just maybe spread to the surrounding neighborhoods, and that would have been it. People used to be born and live and die within 2 or 3 miles of where they were born. Nowadays, just within a week, with air travel the way it is, and with our geographic systems the way they are, with supply chains and economic infrastructure the way it is, we spread it. So in a sense, we brought it on ourselves and then we spread it. So, if I was in the courtroom again as a lawyer and I was prosecuting humankind for this, I wouldn't really have to go very near God at all. A lot of this is on us. Just like climate change, just like a lot of the diseases that we blame God for that we actually bring on ourselves, things like lung cancer, things like obesity, things like diabetes, these are all, man-made things. So there is that aspect of it as well. That being said, this God that we speak of as Christians, we talk about him as sovereign, we talk about him as all powerful, we talk about him as all knowing. And so the fact remains that if he is who we say he is, he could have stopped it. He could have stopped it. That is true. That is true. Regardless of whether or not he caused it, he certainly could have stopped it. So the question is articulated in a very philosophically and theologically sensible way, because the question didn't say, why did God cause this? The question said, why did God allow this? And that is true. Now, there's a lot of reasons why God allows certain things, and there's a lot of things flying around the internet now and flying around churches and sermons to try to hypothecate on why God might have allowed this. And I think a lot of those explanations, have some sensibility in them. There are many reasons why God might have allowed this. He might have just wanted to get the attention of a world that was increasingly ignoring him. He might have wanted to teach us something about suffering and perseverance and endurance. He might have wanted us to teach us about how we need to be pouring out his love on each other sacrificially and selflessly. He might have simply just been trying to get our attention, get the attention of people who have ignored him, maybe for their whole lives. He might have been trying to get people to turn back to him who might have known who he was, but have begun ignoring him or been drifting away from him. It might be a gut check. It might be any number of things. And people out there, and in the Bible too, we see some examples of it, being punishment or being the outworking of things that people have done. But I think the most important thing is that because we're not God, it doesn't really help us to speculate on any of those things because we simply don't know, because of, as I said, our lack of cognition and our lack of epistemic access and our lack of comparative understanding compared to God. We just simply don't know. What we do know is what God wants us to do now, here and now in the middle of this pandemic. That we know without a shadow of a doubt. He wants us to step into or to step deeper into relationship with him. And he wants us to pour out the love that he offers us through relationship with him onto each other. That's all he's ever wanted from us. Loving relationship with him and for us to be in loving relationship with each other. That's the same today as it was 3 months ago before COVID began. It's the same as it was in the 1950s. It's the same as it was in the 1300s. Same as it was at the beginning, the first hours of humankind. God has always wanted to do things from us, loving relationship with him, and for us to be in loving relationship with each other. So it's interesting sometimes to speculate theologically about why God might have allowed this. I think it's a combination of a lot of factors, if you ask me personally. But again, what would I know and what would you know? Only God ultimately knows. What we do know is that what he wants us to take from this. And in that context, this does make sense. We have analogical parallels that we can draw. When you see someone dealing with a tire on the side of the road, trying to change their tire on their car that's had a puncture in it, very rarely do you find the person or the driver speculating on why the tire became flat. No one really cares about the cause of the flat tire. You just want to get the tire off and get the spare tire on and get on with your journey and throw the tire out. And so I think healthy thinking and healthy living now as a Christian and as a non-Christian shouldn't really spend too much time trying to speculate on why this has happened or why God allowed it to happen or why this has come about. Look, the tire's flat. Let's just fix it and get on with it. And we know very clearly what that looks like in the Christian message, in the context of the Christian message, loving God and loving each other. So I'm not trying to squib the question. I'm not saying we simply don't know. I'm saying there's any number of reasons it could have been that God has allowed this to happen. It's probably a combination of all of those things. But I think the fundamental thing that he wants to do always through all circumstances that all of us are going through is he wants to point us back to himself. And that's exactly what he's doing. And so if what comes out of this is that we, might turn to him, we might go deeper in our relationship with him, and we might pour out selfless, sacrificial love on one another as a result of this, then I think that's exactly what we should be doing. Thanks so much for the question. I spent a long time on it. I'm sorry about that, Dennis, but it was probably one of the more important questions we were going to get tonight. So I wanted to spend a bit longer on it. I hope it was helpful.
Yep, definitely. It's really one of the questions that people have been asking. And probably another question that people, to some of their minds, is that, this person is asking, I'm a rather negative person, and sometimes I find it hard to trust God and to have faith, because faith feels like this false kind of optimism, just hoping for something that's better. How can I really grow in my faith?
I had a law professor back when I was at university that said, I hate optimism. Optimism is like taking a big pile of horse manure and putting ice cream on it and saying everything's okay. And I tend to agree. I agreed with that professor, and I agree with this questioner. So thank you for the honesty of your question. I think optimism is often misunderstood as a concept, and I think it's incorrectly practiced by people who, no matter how bad things are, they say, everything's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. The power of positive thinking. I'll be honest with you guys. I think that's rubbish. I don't think positive thinking actually gets you anywhere. Positive action can get you somewhere. But I think to have positive action that's effective, you first need a realistic diagnosis of the problem. And so I think we can be really honest with ourselves that this is not good, what's happening right now. It's not good socially. It's not good economically. It's not good politically. It's not good experientially. It's not good relationally. It's not good for our families. It's not good for our marriages. It's not good for our kids. This whole idea that, it's great that we can keep doing things on Zoom. That's a horrible thing that we have to do things on Zoom. Zoom is just the second worst alternative. The worst alternative is not to do anything at all. The fact that we can do this on Facebook Live and Insta TV and on Zoom, it's great, but it's nowhere near as great as if we were all together physically. If we could shake each other by the hand and fellowship together and look into each other's eyes and actually kind of hug and high five, relate to each other in the way that we were built to relate to each other. So I'm with you in that there's no need for optimism in that sense. I think the way to be optimistic is to say, in the midst of the rubbish, in the midst of the terrible situation, in the midst of lamenting how difficult things are at the moment, is there a way through it and a hope beyond it for something better? And I don't think that's so much optimistic. That's actually just being positively active and hoping in something real. So I think the word optimism has been tossed and twisted and taken out of context a lot. And so I understand the difficulty to have faith and trust in the midst of difficult and terrible situations. But I think if you put the word optimism to one side for a second and just think about the word trust, I think you used that in your question, that's a much more important word. This God that I'm talking about, he is asking you to trust him. So you're right, he's asking you to trust him. And the word trust itself is a very interesting and very powerful word. Trust necessarily assumes a gap in information. It assumes incomplete information on the part of the person who is being called to trust. If you think about when you have complete knowledge of something, there's no need to trust. There's no need to trust. I don't need to trust that 1 + 1 = 2. I have complete deductive knowledge of that. I can prove it to myself deductively. I don't need to trust it. I don't need to have faith in the idea that 1 + 1 = 2. I need to trust that it's going to rain tomorrow if the weather forecast says it's going to rain. I don't have deductive proof of that. I have some inferential knowledge that it's going to rain. I see the weather systems. I see the atmospheric science, those qualified in the atmospheric sciences and the experts in geoengineering that tell me, the meteorologists that tell me that it's going to rain tomorrow. But I don't have deductive proof. I have to trust in them. I have to trust inferentially that that's going to happen. So there's incomplete information whenever there's trust. And that's exactly what God is saying. God understands that what he's asking you to do is to trust him. He's saying there's an amount of information that you do not have, as I said earlier, because of two things: your cognitive capacity and your epistemic access. Because you're not me. For those two reasons, you can't understand everything there is out there. And even if you could, where you are doesn't put you in an epistemic place where you have access to all of the information. Because we live in a world of space and time. So we don't have access to any information from outside of space and time, except to the extent that God reveals that information to us. So because of that, God is saying, look, there are going to be things that you don't know and you don't understand. and I'm going to need you to trust me. But I'm only asking you to trust me with that information gap. All right. Because what the smart skeptic would say, and I hope this questioner would then say, okay, God, you're asking me to trust you. On what basis can I trust you? That's a fair question. The question of, God, I don't trust you because I don't know everything about everything. I don't know why this COVID-19 has happened. I don't know why this loved one of mine passed away. I don't know why I'm struggling with this. I don't know why I'm struggling with that. To ask God why all of those things and then to refuse to trust him because you don't understand why, that's not being fair on God, and it's not being right-headed in terms of an intellectual context. But it is fair to ask God, okay, I can accept that I'm not going to know everything about everything, but on what basis should I trust you, God? On what basis should I trust you? That's a good question. That's a fair question. And when we ask that question, God says to us through his Bible, through his Holy Spirit, and through the truth of who he is and what he's telling us, he says, I'm so glad you asked that question. I'm so glad you asked on what basis can you trust me? Here's the basis on which you can trust me. And then he gives us all of this evidence, all that evidence I was referring to. It's up to us to look through that evidence, though. It's not just going to magically appear in our minds. We have to go out there and investigate it. We have to tune into events like this and ask our questions and take the answers seriously and think on them and pray on them and meditate on them, because the evidence is there. The evidence which forms the basis on which we can reasonably put our trust in God. God says, there's so much that you can know about me. There's so much evidence out there. And then there are some certain things that you're not going to understand. But the evidence is so great for who I am and how much I love you and what I've done for you and what I want to do for you. The evidence is so great that you can trust me with the things you don't know because of the things you do know. He's given us more than enough of himself in the light so we can trust him in the dark. And if we want any one major historical thing to point to, it's the cross of Jesus Christ. That's the basis on which we can trust him. The fact that he came into this world for us as a person, he stepped into human history, went to a cross for us because he loved us so much. That's the basis on which we can trust him. He's proven himself trustworthy in so many different ways. And if you're a follower of Jesus, then you will know that he's proven himself, even in your own life, in so many different ways, trustworthy. But even if none of that had been the case, he's proven himself trustworthy at the cross. So we can go through any amount of suffering in this life, knowing that we can still trust him because he's proven himself in the light. But I assure you that if you just draw deeper into relationship with him, spend time with him, spend time in his Bible, spend time with people that know him and love him, spend time meditating on his truth, then you will come deeper into that relationship with him, and that will create its own feedback loop of evidence. And that will boost your trust and boost your capacity to be able to have faith in this God that knows you and loves you so much. Thank you for the question. Great question.
Yeah, that's so good. Someone is asking about how do we reconcile long-term hurts and lifelong hurts that some of us might be going through and suffering. And if God is sovereign and he's loving, how do we explain things like that? Things that people have to go through, like homelessness and pain.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good question. And I mean, it's interesting that the first three questions have been about suffering. I think that it says a lot about where we are right now. And I'm so glad that you're trusting us with these questions. So I really appreciate that vulnerability of trusting with a question with such importance for so many of us. The reality, I think, of humankind and the reality of our world is that we're both broken. There's a great book by Marilyn Robinson. She wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel called Gilead. And in that novel, it says very powerfully, she writes, there are two realities that plague all of creation: my insufficiency to the world and the world's insufficiency to me. My insufficiency to the world and the world's insufficiency to me. So what she's saying is that there are two things that you can't really avoid or deny. One is this feeling, this sense that no matter how well I do or how good I feel about myself and about what I've done, there's something about me that's still not quite right. And this kind of latent hurt and latent suffering is the perfect example of that. Similarly, no matter how hard we work and how well we build our societies, and in Singapore, we talk about the model society, we have this amazing city with 2 sovereign wealth funds and these clean roads and these beautiful MRTs and great schools and all of that. But no matter how well we do all of that, there's still something about our world and our society that's not quite right. No matter what we do, there's something about me that's not quite right, and there's something about the world that's not quite right. And when you look at the Christian message, that's exactly what it says. It says, yeah, the world is broken and we are broken as people. We are both imperfect. So if Christianity is true, that's what you would expect to see. You'd expect to see a broken world, and you'd expect to see broken people. And you'd expect to see, sadly, all of these tragedies, things like homelessness and congenital defects and genetic abnormalities and inequality and poverty and all of these sorts of things, disease, pandemics. You'd expect to see all of these things. The question then becomes, how can we make sense of these things if everything I've said is true about this God that's redeemed suffering and so forth? And it's an interesting and important point to make about the cross of Jesus Christ itself. The cross of Jesus Christ does two really important things. It opens up the possibility of an up close and personal, loving relationship that each person can have with God through him. Secondly, through that relationship, it offers us an enhanced quality of life, both in this life and an eternal future with no suffering at all. So, an enhanced quality of life in this life and perfection and ultimate redemption in the next life. What it doesn't do is eliminate the reality of the brokenness of the world and the brokenness of who we are in this life. And that's why so many Christians are such terrible people. You know, I don't want to say that glibly, but becoming a Christian doesn't automatically exempt you from suffering. It doesn't automatically turn you into a perfect person that's just full of love and joy and peace all the time. It doesn't exempt you from mental illness. It doesn't exempt you from uh, um, poverty necessarily. It doesn't exempt you from any of those things, because the world is still broken and we are still broken. Ultimate redemption is going to come. Ultimate redemption is going to come on the other side. But this world remains broken, and we remain broken as well, whether we're Christians or we're not. What we can count on is the love and companionship and the up close and personal transformation we can experience of a God who knows us and loves us and is willing to walk with us through the brokenness of the world and through our own brokenness. So this is a God that conquers through the suffering. He doesn't conquer around it. And other worldviews will tell you this. They will tell you, come to this worldview and all the suffering will disappear. If only everyone believed this, then there'd be no more homelessness, there'd be no more disease, there'd be no more of this and no more of that. Well, Christianity, isn't that mythological. It isn't that abstract. It's not a fairy tale. It's real. It's true. And because of that, it's real about how it diagnoses the human condition. And it says that the world is messed up and people are messed up. And so when you come into a relationship with Jesus Christ, your messed upness doesn't change. The world doesn't suddenly become amazing. But what happens is that you start to become more like him. You start to see the world through God's eyes. And he actually comes and lives inside you through what we Christians call his Holy Spirit. It sounds a bit weird and spooky, but the Holy Spirit is basically the Holy Spirit of Jesus. That's the best way to think about it. It's him actually coming and living inside you and with you. And from that, we can draw comfort. We can draw strength. Our minds can be strengthened. Our understanding of God and of our world gets enhanced. Our capacity to discern truth and to exercise wisdom in practical situations gets enhanced. So it's not that being a Christian suddenly makes life easy, but it makes life amazing. It makes it awesome. And so, in the midst of all of the struggle and the suffering that's out there, what God says to us is, I want you to be in relationship with me. And I want you also to be out there pouring out this supernatural love on all of the brokenness of the world. And that's why you see, and there's been no capacity to disprove this, that the largest amount of the alleviation of suffering in the social, political, economic, and medical sphere have come through Christian faith-based organizations and people that have been walking with Jesus. If you look at it, even from the abolition of slavery to the invention of the concepts of hospitals to institutionalized medicine through to liberal democracy with universal voting to equal rights to the abolition of torture to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it all comes from a Judeo-Christian worldview to the point that, and this is so widely accepted by moral, political philosophers, economists, the great thinkers of history, that the great atheist professor, Jürgen Habermas, he said that humankind owes its entire understanding of moral consciousness to the Jewish ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. Humankind owes its entire understanding of moral consciousness to the Jewish ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. So what God is saying is that we will continue to be broken and the world will continue to be broken, but we have access to this supernatural love through which we can start to do the redeeming work that God will ultimately himself fulfill and complete on the other side? But great question.
Thank you. I think that we really have a lot of questions that's coming on from people, but due to the time limitation, we can't answer every question. And we'll end off with this last and final question. I mean, you mentioned that you said just now that not everything comes from God, and sometimes if we only attribute the good things to God, does it make our faith just hinge on something that's what we think it is true, and it becomes true, a confirmation bias? And is our hope then in something that is really true and stable and not just our imagination?
That's a really important question. It's so important because, I mean, especially here in Singapore, and I know you're not all from Singapore necessarily tuning in digitally, you could be from anywhere, but I know most of you are. We do, I think, place a high view of success in economic and financial success. And so we think to ourselves, well, if God loves me, then things should go well for me in these aspects of my life, whether it's the education of my kids or my career or my investment portfolio or whatever it might be. The reality of what the Bible says is that it has a very different definition of success. It also has a very different approach to happiness. And so because of that, it takes us right back then to how we can first anchor our hope. The reality of what scripture says, what the Christian scripture says, is that it never promises happiness anywhere in the Bible. You never see a promise of happiness. What you see is a promise of joy. And joy is a qualitatively different thing to happiness. Now, in the world out there, they don't understand that. In fact, if you Google the word happiness and the word joy, what you'll see is that if you ask what happiness means, one of the things it's defined as is that it's a component of joy. And if you look at what joy means, joy is just a whole lot of happiness. So the world out there doesn't understand the difference qualitatively. The world thinks that joy is just a whole lot of happiness, or joy is a synonym for happiness. But in the Bible, both in the Hebrew and in the Greek, which are the original languages of the Bible, there are qualitative differences to happiness and joy. And you don't see happiness really talked about at all. You see joy talked about again and again and again. And you see a qualitative difference. Happiness refers to a feeling that we get because of the environmental stimuli that we come across, whether it's physical pleasure or something we're watching or some money that we make or the friends that we have or the Facebook likes or the Instagram shares or whatever it might be. It's based in natural realities, things inside this world. And because of that, you can actually generate your own happiness in your own strength. You don't need God for that. There are lots of people out there who are happy without God. Happiness is just a feeling, so you can generate that anyway. But joy is not based on natural realities. Joy is based on a supernatural reality that ultimately begins with our relationship with God. And once our relationship with God is there, and it's in the place where it is meant to be, then everything else in the world becomes joyous and joyful in a constant state. And that's why more often than not in the Bible, it actually uses the word joy in its verbal tense, not its noun tense. It actually is talking about rejoice. It's talking about rejoicing. And it's because we are so overwhelmed with joy that we are in this relationship with God, that our future is secure, that our identity is secure, and even through suffering, that we have comfort and strength to get through that suffering, and we have the promise of an eternal hope with no more suffering at all, that even the suffering of this life can't really get us down. It can't mess with our joy. It can make us unhappy, of course, but even in the midst of our unhappiness, there's a joy in knowing that that supernatural reality can't be touched. So Christians that are walking with Jesus, that are in love with him, their levels of happiness continue to go like this, just like anyone else. And it's because of the brokenness of the world and the brokenness of us as people, which I've already talked about. Bad things continue to happen. COVID, pandemics, job losses, these things all continue to happen. But our joy is anchored in the person of Jesus Christ. Our joy is anchored somewhere outside of the storm. It's anchored outside of the world. We put our hope ultimately in something that is beyond us, beyond this pandemic, beyond this lockdown. But it's also beyond our economic and financial success. It's beyond whom we're going to marry. It's beyond where our kids are going to go to school. Our hope is anchored beyond all of these things. You know, probably the greatest king of Israel and a great contributor to the first part of the Bible that we Christians call the Old Testament. His name was David, King David, and he wrote a ton of stuff in a book called Psalms in the Old Testament. And he writes this beautiful psalm where he's just pouring his heart out to God. And he's come to understand that he needs to put all of his hope in God. He needs to put all of his hope not in money, not in power, not in his own popularity, not in his own security. It's all pretty much gone to nothing. He's a pandemic crisis, effectively. And he's just throwing everything at God now. He's like, I finally understand now. I've just got to put everything on you and just hope in you, even amidst the suffering, even amidst the uncertainty. And then he says powerfully at the end of that psalm, he says, some people put their hope in chariots, some people put their hope in horses, but I will hope in the name of the Lord. He uses the word trust. It can be easily translated to hope. Some people trust in chariots, some people trust in horses, but we put our trust in the name of the Lord our God. That person's name, in a relational sense, is the person of Jesus Christ. And you have the opportunity to put your trust in him today for the first time, or perhaps to reaffirm that trust for the first time in a long time. So no matter what happens, no matter how bad things get, and even in the midst of suffering, you can know that the reality of who God is doesn't depend on how well things are going in this world or how well things are going in your life. The world is imperfect and you and I are both imperfect, but God is perfect. And when we put our hope in him, we put hope in something that transcends all of the imperfections and the brokenness that we have to deal with in this world.
Thanks, Max. Thanks so much for the time and answering the questions and doing a sharing.
Thank you,
for
Dennis.
the rest of last year.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure being with you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really hope that through this whole session today, that all of us get to hear and find that every one of us, we can find hope and we can find joy in the person and the relationship with Jesus. And I want to encourage you to join us and to journey with us together. The fact that you have so many questions means that you really are seeking and wanting to know the God that we know. And I want to encourage you to continue to just journey with us and join us in our services. And some of you, you might not have come to our church before, you have joined us before. In the next, we do have services going on online, and we want to continue to invite you to join us in the various services that we have. Parents, we have Parents' Day. We are celebrating Mother's Day together, and we're going to have a very special Parents' Day service. And we're having this special guest, Lina Ng and Mike Lam, Hong Shufang, MediaCorp actress, and she's coming to share with us her story and her journey in her parenting and her story of how she came to know God as well. So I encourage you to join us. Those of you who are in Poly and IT, we have very special service lined up for you. The information are down there in our link there. You can check out more, and we hope to invite you to join us for the next few in our coming week services. So rest of us, have a good night. I will see you in this Sunday service, this Saturday and Sunday service. I'll see you then. Bye, church.